Well, good evening. We are continuing to go through the book Last Things First by Graham Bainan. We're on chapter 3, the title Real Rewards. And I'm going to read now the passage from Luke chapter 19 that we'll be focusing on this evening. So that's Luke 19, verse 11 to 27. As they heard these things, Jesus proceeded to tell a parable, because he was near to Jerusalem, and because they supposed that the kingdom of God was to appear immediately. He said, therefore, "A nobleman went into a far country to receive for himself a kingdom and then return. Calling 10 of his servants, he gave them 10 minas and said to them, 'Engage in business until I return.' But his citizens hated him and sent a delegation after him, saying, 'We do not want this man to reign over us.' When he returned, having received the kingdom, he ordered these servants to whom he had given the money to be called to him, that he might know what they had gained by doing business. The first came before him, saying, 'Lord, your mina has made 10 minas more.' And he said to him, 'Well done, good servant. Because you have been faithful in a very little, you shall have authority over 10 cities. And the second came, saying, 'Lord, your mina has made 5 minas.' And he said to him, 'And you are to be over 5 cities.' Then another came, saying, 'Lord, here is your mina, which I kept laid away in a handkerchief. For I was afraid of you, because you are a severe man. You take what you did not deposit, and reap what you did not sow.' He said to him, 'I will condemn you with your own words, you wicked servant. You knew that I was a severe man, taking what I did not deposit, and reaping what I did not sow. Why then did you not put my money in the bank, and at my coming I might have collected it with interest?' And he said to those who stood by, 'Take the mina from him, and give it to the one who has the 10 minas.' And they said to him, 'Lord, he has 10 minas.' 'I tell you that to everyone who has, more will be given. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. But as for these enemies of mine, who did not want me to reign over them, bring them here and slaughter them before me.'" Luke tells us in verse 11 that Jesus is near to Jerusalem. In fact, when we get to verse 28, we start reading about how Jesus will enter Jerusalem riding on a donkey, and we find crowds cheering as he comes into the city and calling him the King who comes in the name of the Lord. In fact, when we read about that event in Matthew chapter 21, we're also told that some people were referring to Jesus as the Son of David. That's a reference to a promise given centuries earlier to King David, that one of his descendants would become ruler over God's people in an eternal kingdom. The Jewish people expected Jerusalem to be the capital of this kingdom. It's no surprise then to find Luke making reference to this expectation in Luke chapter 19, verse 11. And he tells us that Jesus proceeded to tell a parable because he was near to Jerusalem and because they supposed that the kingdom of God was to appear immediately. The parable is meant to inform their expectations and ours too. The beginning of the story immediately contradicts the expectations of the people. Verse 12, "A nobleman went into a far country to receive for himself a kingdom and then return." The one who would become king doesn't just set up his throne and sit down. He goes away first. At that time, the people would have understood this way of doing things. They were part of the Roman Empire under Roman occupation. So any promotion to a royal position would first require a trip to the Roman emperor to get the go-ahead. We might think today of a young couple wanting to get married, but the man firstly goes to the woman's father to seek his blessing. But the Jewish people were expecting their king to stay and the Romans to leave. Yet Jesus says in the parable that the one who would become king will first go away. The crowds expect Jesus to become king almost there and then, but he tells them through the parable that he will first go away to return later as the established king. Before the nobleman leaves, he gives a task to his servants. He wants them to, verse 13, engage in business. And it's important to notice that this king and his servants are not the only characters in this parable. In verses 14 and 27, Jesus tells us of citizens who rejected the king, who wanted him removed. He refers to them as his enemies in verse 27. They do not want this nobleman to become king and to rule over them. So we start with a simple picture of a nobleman who will leave and then later return as king, and this future king is Jesus. We're also told of servants who are called to carry out a task for him, and of citizens who don't want this man to rule over them. And this parable is meant to tell us what we should expect of the promised king and what he expects of those who call themselves his servants. But this also clearly tells us something about the experience of the servants while they wait for the king to return. There will be an atmosphere of animosity towards the king and therefore towards his servants. As we've seen in 1 Peter recently on Sundays, we will share in the sufferings of Christ while we wait for the day he returns, and we share in the joy of Christ. So this parable confirms the words in 1 Peter 4 verse 12, "Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you." We are living in that time of waiting for the king to return. And it should not surprise us if the hostility people have towards Christ as king is sometimes directed towards Christians as his servants. What was his expectation? What was the master looking for from his servants while he was away? We find the answer in verses 13 and 15. He gives 10 servants 1 mina each, a mina being a specific value of money. And he tells them to engage in business. He wants them to invest the money so that when he returns, he is able to know what they had gained by doing business. What would you do today if you were asked to invest money? 6 months ago, if you were very astute, you might have thought of buying shares in a company called Zoom Video Communications. Well, when the nobleman returns in verse 15, we're told that he has now received the kingdom. You might think then that if the kingdom is his, what would be so important about a little bit of money? Well, we see its importance when we look at the king's response to the servants who made wise investments. In verse 16, the first servant reveals he made 10 minas from that 1 mina. How does his master respond? Verse 17, "Well done, good servant. Because you have been faithful in a very little, you shall have authority over 10 cities." So the king isn't really looking to make money. If 1 mina is something he refers to as very little, then 10 minas isn't great shakes either. The king is interested in the faithfulness of the servant, in how concerned the servant is to do what would please his master. And as reward, he gives him authority over 10 cities. The reward far outweighs the returns on the investment made by the servant. We see the same in verses 18 and 19, where the second servant reveals that he has made 5 minas from the 1 mina. Again, the reward far outweighs the returns. The king gives to the servant an honor that far outweighs the financial profit that he has made. This is a generous king who acknowledges the faithfulness of his servants and rewards them, we might say, outrageously. We definitely would be wrong to view this reward as if it were a wage that had been earned. It is a gift that rewards faithfulness. And this should encourage us today as we seek to be faithful to Jesus. We find another example in Luke chapter 6, verse 22 and 23, where Jesus said, Blessed are you when people hate you and when they exclude you and revile you and spurn your name as evil on account of the Son of Man. Rejoice in that day and leap for joy, for behold, your reward is great in heaven. Jesus will reward us when we remain faithful, even though it brings the hostility of others upon us. What Jesus teaches here is then echoed by his apostles, namely that those who faithfully serve Christ on earth will be rewarded in heaven. For example, in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 7 to 9, when writing to slaves, the Apostle Paul tells them to behave as servants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, rendering service with a good will as to the Lord and not to man, knowing that whatever good anyone does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether he is slave or free. Masters, do the same. We're to serve as servants of Christ, whatever role we have in society. Of course, we need to be careful that we don't develop a wrong attitude towards these rewards. We've already recognized that the reward is not a wage. It is far too generous for us to consider it that way. The reward vastly outweighs the returns. We also need to notice that the king highlights the faithfulness of his servants. In verse 17, the reward is given because you have been faithful. So the king rewards faithfulness, not selfishness. Just as we shouldn't see the reward as a wage, so we also shouldn't see it as a pension, as though our purpose in serving this king is ultimately not to please him, but instead to make sure we have a nice nest egg at the end of it. And so the more we put in now, the more we'll get back later. As Graham Bainan writes in his book, Jesus knows the difference between the servant who is faithful because of a selfish hope of greater reward and the servant who is faithful simply because of a desire to please their master. It made me think of words from the hymn, the 5th verse of the hymn, "The sands of time are sinking." Let me read them to you. About the return of Christ. "The bride eyes not her garment, but her dear bridegroom's face. I will not gaze at glory, but on my King of grace. Not at the crown he giveth, but on his pierced hand. The Lamb is all the glory of Emmanuel's land." There clearly is an incentive here to be faithful to Jesus, because we can see that he cares about our faithfulness. It matters to him. It shouldn't surprise us then to see that the master in the parable responds differently to servants when they have behaved differently. He notices and responds differently to the second servant, giving him a generous reward but less than the first servant. We see a different response again when he meets the third servant, but the difference is really striking. The third servant tells the master that he simply wrapped the mina in a handkerchief and kept it safe. He didn't even take the no-risk option and put it in a bank where it would gain a little bit of interest. The reason he gives, that the king is a severe man, seems a bit bizarre after seeing how the first two servants were treated. His comment that you take what you did not deposit and reap what you did not sow also seems bizarre, as the king had made a deposit with each of the 10 servants, and on his return he therefore expected to reap what he had sowed. Here was a generous king who gave resources to his servants, who expected them to serve him well using those resources, and who then enjoyed giving his servants an abundant reward. But as the king points out, the third servant's own words condemn him. If he really thought that this king was so severe, why didn't he at least put the mina in the bank and get the interest? Instead, he does nothing with what he has been given. So what is the outcome? There is no reward. And even what was first given to the servant is taken from him. He remains in the kingdom. He doesn't face the judgment that the king's enemies then face in the final verse of this passage. But he also misses out on that abundant reward. We might think of the passage we looked at last week in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 10 to 15. There we read of those who build on the foundation of the gospel, but they use cheap materials, which are burned up on the day of judgment. In other words, they invest little of themselves into serving Christ, and there is little of eternal consequence to show or to reward at the end. So this parable encourages us to live for Christ and serve him well while we wait for his return from heaven. We should aim to say, along with the Apostle Paul, to live is Christ and to die is gain. We should seek to be faithful to our Master, taking the resources he has given to us and using them to serve him and therefore to please him. He is a generous King who notices everything that we do for him and who on the day of his return will abundantly and outrageously reward those who have served him faithfully. And so if we are wise, we will let the evaluation of that last day inform our view of this eternal King and shape our lives now.